Alright, so after watching all of the videos and kind of thinking about the questions, the 4 questions that were asked to me, I realized that looking for childcare for a child isn't really so black and white. I think a lot of things come into play when you're looking for childcare, one of them being where you're located, how much money you make, when you go to visit the schools, the priorities that they have and how well they line up with your priorities that you have for your child. When looking at public schools, for example, you want to look at how well that they're ranked nationally or in your state or in your community. And then most importantly, looking at your child itself and focusing on their needs. If your child seems to be like more artsy, then you're going to want to look at more artsy schools or more athletic, or if they seem to be really shy or maybe more loving, or if they seem to be like slow to progress and slow to develop, or maybe they're just more gifted. All of those things definitely come into play when it comes to looking at schools because different approaches will match your child's different needs and their approaches to life. I think it's also important to note that all of those things are on a sliding scale. So there could be one school that is a 10 out of 10 on really like artistic values, but then maybe is only 2 out of 10 on being sports. But then another school focuses a lot on helping not necessarily kids with disabilities, but kids that maybe just are struggling with learning. But then there's another school, but then that same school also is kind of lower on focusing on gifted children because they help with those children that are harder to progress. So each school individually has a sliding scale of different characteristics. But overall, I think when it comes to looking for like an ideal kindergarten, you're first going to have to visit and see if you get along with faculty and staff, because if you don't, then that really puts a barrier on the parent-faculty relationship, parent-teacher relationship, and if that struggles, then it's obviously going to affect the child if you can't do well with the child's teacher. Then I'd need to probably take an account to like where I am located physically and how much money I make. But then after that, I would definitely take into account my personal child and how my personal child is developing and how they like to grow, and focus at the things that I previously mentioned to make a determination. Like I said before, choosing an approach isn't so black and white. On a side note, I did grow up in all public schools, so from preschool through high school, I was in public education. But in my hometown, all of our public schools were nationally ranked really, really well. So I received a education that was very similar, if not better, than many private or special curriculum schools. So if I happen to live in an area that has extremely well-ranked public schools, then that's definitely where I'll probably send my children. But in this hypothetical scenario, I'm just going to pretend that my child is a really quick learner and really smart, but has trouble when it comes to like direct, forceful commands and being pushed too hard. I would know this about my hypothetical child based on the home life, and realizing that my child would never like to be told to do something, and that they would get really frustrated if I ever tried to explain something to them that they didn't necessarily understand or just didn't get. I'd also take into consideration that maybe the public schools in my area weren't that great, and that's what forced me to look at different private facilities. So considering these aspects, I'd probably choose the private Waldorf method due to the fact that my child would never be overwhelmed, but just stretched enough to learn and develop. The Waldorf method tries to cultivate imagination and inspiration and intuition, and these are all formed through a sense of spiritual guidance. It's not necessarily religion, but it's a type of meditation by focusing on the human body and the human being and how yourself as an individual grows and prospers and develops, obviously. So based on the video and some more reading that I did on this Waldorf method, I learned that it focuses a lot on love, freedom, and a child finding itself. The love aspect comes more from developing strong relationships between the child and the teacher and realizing that they're like loved and cared for. And then by doing this, it allows them to like learn better and find who they are as a person based on what they're learning and who's teaching them, honestly. And then this will develop that sense of freedom that they have that will send them out into the world to do bigger and better things because they feel loved and they know their morals, so they can be more free. This method also treasures a lot of like movement and brain development by incorporating sports and music and a lot of different aspects, not just like one strict thing, to find a certain level of balance. Like I talked about earlier with a sliding scale, the Waldorf method focuses a lot on incorporating all of those to the highest capacity so that a child individually can find what they really like to do and their individual balance, what makes them the happiest. And by incorporating sports and music, that allows them to use a specific level of body energy and learn with the whole body, not just their brain, I guess. It also approaches a child at a level that is emotionally, spiritually, and educationally balanced. Like I said before, not just brain, but emotional and spiritual. By doing this, it allows the teacher to determine what is the best way for a child to learn and making sure that the child is never overwhelmed or not ready to move on to something bigger. When a child isn't ready to go on to a next level, then there shouldn't be a pressure put on that child. And with the Waldorf method, that pressure is never put on because there's not a certain sense of being overwhelmed to learn more than they're ready for. This approach also focuses a lot, like I said before, on art, but it also focuses on like beauty and being creative and just overall being artistic in your learning. In the video, it says that children very often make their own textbooks by combining all of their drawings and all of their writings into a binder. So by doing this, it makes it really hard to ever forget information that you are taught or that you learned or that you create on your own because you're the one creating it. So it makes it hard to forget it because you're not just sitting down and reading a book, like you're developing your learning. So since my hypothetical child is very smart but has a hard time moving on to something new until they're ready and also gets really overwhelmed with direct commands, picking an education that works well with those characteristics really came into play. So picking the Waldorf method allows my child to be in a private school that will focus on their needs and determine the best way for them to learn. It'll also allow my child to not be so overwhelmed, but push just enough that they are excited to learn something new and not feel like they're forced to learn something new, and that they want to continue to grow and develop, but do so in a really artistic and wholesome way. I like the idea of my child not just learning by reading a textbook, but by creating and finding through who they are. I really liked this activity. I liked learning about different curriculums, whether it be private or public. I was always had a really strong stance on public schools being good, but obviously if you're in a situation where public schools aren't ranked that great, then looking into private schools would definitely be an incredible option. And I think the Waldorf method really allows a child to grow and prosper and develop in a way that maybe a not so great public school would be able to do. So by creating and learning who you are through an artistic way, but also getting a great education, I think that's the best way to go.